The development and abandonment of Chicago's many transportation systems has led the city to having some of the most mysterious forgotten tunnels, deep below the towering skyline. Today we examine a few hidden under the river that were built centuries prior to accommodate horse carts and pedestrians, but later were converted for streetcars and now have all but been left to rot. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you are watching It's History. There was a time when Chicago was home to one of the largest and most profitable networks of cable cars in America. However, this was the effect of a gradual evolution that led the city to having some of the most advanced infrastructure technology on Earth. It's safe to say that the infrastructure required to achieve such a feat was seeded all the way back when people and goods were still moving by horse and carriage. And a major choke point to these logistics was always the Chicago River. When it wasn't poisoning the city's water supply or breaking world records by being re-engineered to run in reverse, it was blocking the city's traffic in a major way. So when the town was growing, urban planners built bridges to guide the traffic across the river. Anyone who's been to Chicago has surely noticed those famous drawbridges that tend to hang open. Well, they were built in the 19th century and they solved very little. You see, most of the bridges remained in that open position constantly due to port traffic. So if you were traveling by horse and carriage, you'd often have to wait for ridiculously long periods of time for your bridge to close. Therefore, city planners decided to build tunnels under the river, serving as a way for pedestrians and wagon traffic to travel to reach the other side of town without delay. It was these tunnels, intended for passage by foot or horse, that eventually became the tunnels used for streetcars. They ran under the river at Washington and Lasalle, opening in 1869 and 1871 respectively, and later an additional tunnel was built at Van Buren Street. Illustrations from that time depict the tunnels as being made of 3 brick-lined archways. The first 2 passages were for wagons and the third for pedestrians. When the Lasalle Street Tunnel opened in 1871, not only did it help alleviate traffic, but it also helped residents escape the Great Chicago Fire only a few months after. So when cable cars were introduced to Chicago in 1882, these tunnels were an obvious solution to get the town moving. It was also the perfect opportunity to utilize a somewhat disliked amenity of the city. Pedestrians often complained about the leaky conditions of the tunnel, and that carriages couldn't always use them because their inclines were too steep. The only obstruction to making them into full-fledged cable car tunnels was that they were too small to accommodate the cable cars themselves. So the city planned a massive renovation, digging the tunnels deeper underground and making them wider. This was a risky feat considering the tunnel's precarious location underneath a massive body of water. However, the renovations were successful, and the new tunnels sat at a similar depth to the current CTA subway tunnels today. Let's have a look at the tunnels individually, starting with the Washington Street Tunnel, which was originally built for pedestrians and horse-drawn traffic. At the time, it was the first such tunnel to run under the river proper. Construction began in 1867, and it opened on January 1st, 1869, but it wasn't successful. The approach grades were too steep for horses. It leaked, and it was dark and uncomfortable for pedestrians. By 1884, it had been closed and deemed unsafe. However, the tunnel saw a resurrection in 1888 when the West Chicago Street Railroad Company began to rehabilitate it. On August the 12th, 1890, cable car service began and continued until August 19th, 1906. The east approach began in the middle of the road just west of Franklin Street, and the track descent was covered. West of the river, the approach climbed, and the track came just to street level east of Clinton. The tunnel, including the approaches, was 1,605 feet long, or 489 meters. After closing in 1906, a wider and deeper replacement was built under the original, and the approaches were deepened to their new level. The grades were aligned for the cars to enter a shallow subway just below the street level. The Washington Tunnel opened to electric streetcar service on January the 29th, 1911, and was in regular use until 1953. Although the tunnel was retired long ago, it was only sealed permanently in 2013, with both approaches being covered. Moving on to the Lasalle Street Tunnel, which was also originally built for pedestrians and horse-drawn traffic. Construction started right after the Washington Street Tunnel was finished, and although the LaSalle Tunnel had a different design, it faced the same problems. The approach grades were too steep for horses, it leaked, and it was dark and uncomfortable for pedestrians. In 1888, the North Chicago Street Railroad leased this tunnel and began to rehabilitate it. On March the 23rd, 1888, cable service began and continued until October the 21st, 1906, when it was closed for lowering. The northern approach began in the middle of the street just north of Hubbard Street. Under the river, the tunnel had 2 horse and 1 pedestrian masonry arch lanes. South of the river, the approach climbed, and the track came to street level north of Randolph Street. The tunnel, including the approaches, was 1,887 feet, or 575 meters long. The tunnel was opened to electric streetcar service on July the 21st, 1912, and was in regular service until November the 27th, 1939, when it was closed during the construction of the Milwaukee Lake Dearborn Congress Subway, now Clark and Lake Station, which intersected the tunnel's southern ramp on Lake Street. As of 1954, the northern tunnel port was still existent, but both approaches are now filled in. Although the tunnel itself exists under the river, a ramp in the middle of LaSalle Street is sometimes mistaken for the northern portal, which was actually a block north and aligned below the current ramp. Finally, there was the Van Buren Street Tunnel, the last of the 3 to be built and the only one to be built privately and specifically for cable cars. Construction began in 1890, but progress was slow. Cable service started on March the 24th, 1894, and ended on July the 22nd, 1906. The east approach began at Franklin Street. Unlike the city-owned tunnels, it didn't go under the street itself, but 150 feet north and parallel. This meant that cars had to slow down, turn north on Franklin, then immediately turn west into a driveway to which the approach was found. It was a stone-walled 30-foot ramp which descended at a 12% grade for 150 feet before being covered under an alley. As the shortest tunnel, it had the steepest grade. Under the river, the tunnel had a single 2-lane arched roof. West of the river, the approach climbed to Clinton Street, where the line had to turn south. The tunnel, including its approaches, was 1,514 feet long, but due to its complex entrances and steep approaches, it always had operating problems. In 1910, a deeper replacement was built through the original tunnel and opened to electric streetcar service, only to close again in 1915 for the construction of approaches to Union Station. The tunnel reopened in 1916. Ultimately, the Van Buren Tunnel was closed for regular service in 1924, but it was used occasionally as late as 1952, when service permanently ended. As technology advanced, so did the railway systems. The private cable car company, the West Chicago Street Railroad, and the city would eventually move from cable cars to electric streetcars, and those electric streetcars turned into the modern-day elevated trains, in Chicago known as the L. Like the fate of the electric streetcar in the rest of America, diesel buses and cars would ultimately become a final nail in the coffin of these amazing systems, leaving the tunnels they once utilized forgotten in time. Mere decades later, the tunnels themselves are fully out of sight. The entrances to these 3 cable and streetcar tunnels were closed and sealed off to the public. There isn't a way to access them, and they're not used in the current CTA infrastructure. However, there was at one point a concept to convert them into traffic tunnels, but the concept was ultimately abandoned as the same steep grades that proved to be problematic for horses were unsafe for cars. No longer available to the public, these tunnels remain a historic part of Chicago's rich story, and I would even argue that the sheer imagination of their existence, abandoned under the river, is part of what gives Chicago a depth of mystery needed in the city's authentic soul. Perhaps you know mysteries involving tunnels. I'd love to hear more about them. Maybe make a video for you. Let me know in the comments section below, and for more It's History, subscribe or consider checking out our daily stories. I'm Ryan Socash, signing off.